Hey everyone, it's Miss Stewart, and today we're going to be learning about section 2.7, which is on ecological succession. And the learning objective for today is going to be describe ecological succession. You're going to get a chance to practice the suggested skill of data analysis. Another learning objective that we'll be getting to is so that you can describe the effect of ecological succession on ecosystems. And some of the knowledge you'll gain is about the type of ecological successions there are, how different types of species play roles in these developing ecosystems, and kind of the progression of how ecosystems come to be through the succession that is occurring or will potentially occur if there's a disturbance in the ecosystem. So first of all, what is ecological succession? And this is a series of predictable stages of growth that a forest goes through. And there's going to be two types of succession. So we have primary succession and secondary succession. I'm going to dive into both of these more in depth in the coming slides. But essentially with ecological succession, you can kind of think of the fact that over time, we have a predictable stages of growth that a forest is going to go to. So we kind of know like what are the types of plants that comes first, what are going to be the plants that comes after, and what are going to be the ones that come farther down the line when we have more time that's been occurring. So the first type of succession is going to be primary succession. And this occurs in an area that has not previously been colonized by plants. So this is going to be areas, basically bare rock is where we see primary succession occurring. So if you think of like volcanic rock on a recently, like a volcano area, like the island of Hawaii, where it's still active and you get that volcanic rock. Or you can also see this with rocks that are exposed after glaciers are retreating and melting away. But essentially when you're getting bare rock is when we're going to see primary succession. Now, moss and lichen, whose spores are dispersed by the wind, they're going to be able to grow directly on rocks by secreting acids that break down the rock and then release minerals containing nutrients they need. So think about like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And the reason why it's important that the spores are dispersed by wind is because that's how these even get in to these bare rock areas, because there aren't any other plants. The moss and lichen are going to be the first one that the wind blows in, and then they're going to be able to grow directly on the rock and start breaking down this rock and releasing the minerals. Now, chemical weathering occurring from the moss and the lichen, so the weathering of this rocks, then starts combining with organic matter from this moss and lichen dying, which start to form like a really shallow amount of soil. So over time, like the moss and lichen are breaking it down, but that moss and lichen are also dying. And then you have microbes that are going in and breaking them down. And this decomposition creates a little bit of soil. And over time, it kind of builds up to where you're starting to get like a little bit of actual soil on top of that bare rock. So if you were to look at this image of like an old lava flow, and all this color, that's going to be the lichen that are starting to come in and grow on that area. And this is the progression that we start to see. You start with bare rocks, and then lichen are going to come in. And then you start to get this breakdown of soil. And over time, you are able to have different species that are able to move in based on the amount of soil. But we first start out with these lichen. They're going to be the pioneer species, which are some of the first species that are coming in, and they make way for the other species that are going to come after. Now, the secondary succession is the second type of succession that we have. And this occurs in an area that already has established soil, but most of its plant life has been removed by a disturbance. So in this, we're going to see pioneer species. And remember that pioneer species are kind of just the first species that come in. So with this secondary succession, the pioneer species are still going to be seeds that came in through the wind. They're dispersed, and then they're going to come in and they're fast growing. They're also going to be sun tolerant Because if we have this disturbance that wiped out everything, we don't have tall trees or shrubs providing shade. So you're going to have these seeds blown in. They're going to have to grow quickly, and they're going to have to be able to tolerate the fact that they don't have any shade protecting them from the sun. So instead of seeing moss and lichen, in secondary succession, the first species that we start to see are like grasses and wildflowers and weeds. Now, we already have soil. So the soil has already been established. And even sometimes if it's a disturbance such as like a fire, you can actually add to the soil by getting really nutrient-rich ash from that soil. And so overall, this is going to be like a more rapid process than primary succession because they already have some soil established and we're not waiting thousands of years for this rock to be slowly broken down. So if we're looking at this kind of similar image, if we have a disturbance like a fire that occurs in the initial species coming in, we're going to see some grasses, some wildflowers, think weeds like dandelions and things that are going to eventually make way for other species. But the difference here is we actually still have this soil level. And remember, because the soil is not having to be broken down, secondary succession is going to occur much faster than primary succession because we're not breaking down rocks. We already have soil here. Secondary succession still can take a long time. Like we could still talk hundreds of years to get to the end point or this like more developed point, but it's still much faster than primary. Now we have stages of succession that are going to be predictable. So these stages are going to be characterized by which types of plant species dominate the ecosystem, and different species are going to be adapted to the conditions of the different stages. So these pioneer or the early succession species are going to appear first when the ground is basically bare rock or bare soil after a disturbance has occurred. Now the characteristics of these are going to be seeds that are spread by the wind. Now they also can be spread by animals. So think like a bear that eats this up and then through its waste, it's going to deposit some of those seeds that made it through the digestive tract, or it might get stuck on the hair of a bear that's walking by, but they're going to be dispersed by the wind or by animals. And they're going to be fast growing and tolerant of shallow soil and full sunlight. So if we're thinking of examples here, think of like your dandelion where you have the wind that's going to blow it away. That's going to be what we're thinking with these pioneer species, specifically the ones that are coming into a secondary succession system. Now, we also have the examples for the bare rock. It's going to be moss and lichen. But then in areas where we have some soil, it will be like wildflowers, raspberries, grasses, or sedges. Now, the next type of organisms that come in are going to be the mid-successional species. And these are going to appear after the pioneer species have already helped to develop deeper soil with that has more nutrients in there because of these cycles of growth and decay. So remember that as these pioneer species are dying, they're being broken down, and that's creating more soil and more nutrients, which means that these mid-successional species can now come in because they already have a bit of deeper soil with more nutrients that are going to be available to them. Now, characteristics of these are going to be, again, still relatively fast growing. They're going to be larger plants that do need deeper soil, and they need more nutrients than some of the pioneers, but they're still going to be sun tolerant, because we're still not seeing any big, massive trees giving shade at this point. So a characteristic is they do still need to be sun tolerant. And if we're looking at kind of this movement of forest succession, again, we've got these pioneer plants first, then we get into kind of like perennial plants and grasses, some shrubs, and we might even get like little trees at this point. And these are going to be some of your more like mid-successional species right in here. But keep in mind, they don't have massive trees at this point. So they still do need to be sun tolerant. But as we're seeing the soil build up there, they do have more soil available to them than the pioneer species did. Now, some examples of these are going to be shrubs, bushes, fast-growing trees like aspen, cherry, and pine. So those are going to be what we're seeing with pioneer species and mid-successional species. Now, the next part of the stage that we're going to have is what's called the late successional, or even the climax community species. Because if you think of a climax, it's kind of like the big event, like towards the end. So these species are going to be appearing last after the soil is deepened and enriched with nutrients from those cycles of growth and decay by the early and the mid-successional species. So we're getting way more soil here that are available to these specific type of organisms. Now, the characteristics of these are going to be large, slow-growing trees that are going to be tolerant of shade and require deep soils for large root networks. Because remember, we're starting to get some of those shrubs and some of those little trees. So as these new trees are coming up out of the soil, they're going to have some shade over them. So that's why they need to be shade tolerant. They're not going to be in direct sunlight like some of our pioneer species were. And they're going to be slower growing. They're going to require deeper soils for their roots to go all the way down. And some examples of these are going to be like maple trees, oak trees, or basically all the other large trees. So if we look here, again, if we're seeing this progression as the soil goes, you're going to end up having these shade tolerant, bigger trees with the deeper root systems. And that's going to be part of our late successional or the climax community species. So what we also have is a couple terms that you should be aware of. And these are going to be keystone and indicator species because they are tied into kind of the overall health and indication of an ecosystem. So the first term, keystone species, this is going to be a species whose activities have a particularly significant role in determining the community structure. They're very important. And basically, if this species were to be removed from the ecosystem, it would drastically change the rest of the ecosystem. An example could be if we think about our boreal forests, typically up north. If we think of the aspen tree in boreal forests, these are going to be a keystone species because they provide habitat for many organisms. So if those got wiped out from a disease or something, it would drastically change the rest of the ecosystem because all of these organisms that used it for habitat, for shelter, for resources, they're not going to have that anymore. So its disappearance would have like cascading effects throughout the rest of the ecosystem. Now, the other type of species we have is an indicator species. And this is going to be an organism that can be used to infer the overall health/condition of an ecosystem. So an example of this, when we're thinking of some of those late successional or those climax species, you're also going to see different animals start moving in at these different phases. So one example might be a northern spotted owl. These owls only live in old growth forests. So if you're seeing northern spotted owls in an ecosystem, that's an indicator that this is an old ecosystem, that these trees have been around for a while and it's old growth forests. So you can use them to kind of track, all right, these are areas that have been around for a long time and have old growth because the northern spotted owl is there. Now, another thing that this can be used for is actually determining pollution presence. So for example, lichens are sensitive to sulfur dioxide. So if there are high levels of sulfur dioxide in an ecosystem, lichens won't grow. So scientists can actually use these indicator species to track pollution in certain areas and be able to tell the kind of more of a qualitative level of the amount of pollution based on the type of species that are or are not found there. So these are kind of, again, important terminology when we're talking about different ecosystems and their health and how to sort of tell where they're at or how they can be impacted from change. So what we have is your practice FRQ for 2.7, and you're going to be practicing the suggested skill of data analysis, explaining patterns and trends in data to draw conclusions. So based on this graph below, I want you to explain whether spruce trees are an early, middle, or late successional species based on the graph that you can see here. So that's going to be your practice FRQ for 2.7. Those were your notes on 2.7 for ecological succession.